So, this is a real quick lecture for those of you if you've missed anything or you've been gone. This is what we've been talking about in class. So, this is just a real quick summary, and this should also work to fill not only those if you've missed something before when we started the class, but also help with that assignment we've done in class on federalism or anti-federalism. So we started with talking about what caused the American Revolution. What caused the American Revolution was simple. Well, it wasn't so simple, but it can be broken down basically into three things. One is taxation without representation. Between things like the Navigation Acts, the Stamp Act, the tea tax, these were all examples of taxes that were given to the Americans, but weren't being enforced upon their English counterparts. And so therefore, they were being taxed unfairly. Also, the fact that the Americans were British citizens, which meant they should have had a say in the creation of these taxes. However, the British were not allowing representation in Parliament for the American colonists. So they were being charged taxes without representation. The other problem we've had was that the Americans were also having their rights violated. When they went to protest these violations, like we saw in the Boston Massacre, they were being assaulted by British troops. The British then, when Americans threw tea in the harbor, that led to the Intolerable Acts. They shut down American trade. They imprisoned people who spoke out. They shut down colonial papers they saw as a threat to British rule. They tried to seize our weapons, which led to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. They were infringing on our rights to assemble and to redress the king. So they were infringing upon our rights. So no taxation representation, infringing on the rights British citizens had. And then on top of it, they were not allowing Americans to move across the Appalachian Mountains. We had helped the British fight the war against France, and all this territory, which was now Illinois and Kentucky and Tennessee and places like that, they weren't allowed to move into. The British didn't want to occupy these areas and then deal with the native populations. But at the same time, they also couldn't collect taxes if people moved over. So they wanted to keep you on one side of the mountains. So keeping you from moving past the Appalachian Mountains, lack of representation and overtaxation, and then the infringing upon rights that were given to British citizens by the English Bill of Rights were the reasons for the Americans going to war. Now, at the same time, how in the world did you win this thing? We really weren't prepared for a war. And if you've watched the video, the Ed puzzle, it sums up basically how the American Revolution went. And basically, here's what it came down to. The Americans, it's our land. We don't have to ship things over here. Plus, we know how the land works. And that led us to better tactics. We fought like the native populations did in many cases, which made us better fighters. We also don't have to worry about shipping troops over. We're already here. Then on top of it, the Americans had better weapons. In many cases, Americans, especially in the frontier areas, were using Kentucky long rifles, which were much better shots and had more accuracy and more range. Using native populations' tactics, we were easily able to decimate British officers and make it harder for them to fight the war. And then, on top of it, the Americans, well, we also had the will to fight. We're fighting for home. We're not fighting like the British soldiers that are paid to fight. We are fighting for our own freedom and for our democracy that's coming. So that's what gave us the advantage to win this war. It all comes down to this one document, the Declaration of Independence, signed in 1776. And basically what it states is that the purpose of a government is to protect the rights of the people. But if the government doesn't represent the rights of the people, then we have the right to dissolve that government and form a new government that does represent those rights. As we said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator in certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that's the basis of the American system. Every 4 years, if you don't like the system, you overthrow the system. You create a new system. Okay? However, part of this whole promise was that all men, and they literally meant that. They meant white men during this time period. So America was created with the very thing that's going to cause its breakup in the 1860s, is it never addressed the issue of slavery. that issue of slavery is what's going to be exacerbated. Sorry, it's not exacerbated. It is going to be exacerbated by the fact of federalism we're going to talk about in some of the other slides here. Also, inherently, it does not address the rights of native populations, nor does it address the rights of women. But it does create the premise of America. And inherently in the Constitution that's coming, it basically creates the idea that we will be a government of the people and by the people. And so this is a good start. We don't fix all the problems with it, and we start some problems that are coming. But this is a good start. From this point, we fight the war. America was divided during the war, but we're going to kind of move ahead here. We already talked about this. We talked about this. And then they surrender Yorktown, and that led to this, the Articles of Confederation. The problem with the Articles of Confederation is that they didn't want a strong government, right? They wanted to have a government because they saw the British were too powerful, and that strong government would basically lead to oppression and tyranny. So there's no central authority, no executive, no control over taxations. But it did limit the power of the government and protected the power of the states. Unfortunately, it doesn't allow the government to address issues. Like, for example, one of the problems is going to be Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion by farmers who were promised payments for their time in the U.S. Army during the American Revolution. At the same time, they were being heavily taxed by the states and had no redress. Without the federal government, there's no way to address these taxation. And landowners then and tax collectors were coming and seizing these farmers' lands. They demanded their payments so they could pay the taxes and have redress about the unfair taxes they're facing. That rebellion is going to lead to a federalism concept that in the end, we need a creation of a constitution that's going to create a strong government that allows people to address this and control their government and allow the government to be more flexible. And it comes down to these two men, Hamilton and Jefferson. So Hamilton and Jefferson, there's Shays' Rebellion. There's a call for a strong central government, which is going to be clearly a federalist concept. Okay. So this is that rebellion by revolutionary soldiers wanting pay, but it shows the need for a strong central government, which is going to be a federalism concept. And that's why they're going to form a new constitution. So they're going to create a bicameral system. There are two houses that represent the states, and one is in the form of a Senate, one in the form of a House. They're going to also create a balance of power where the federal government is divided into three parts, where the executive branch enforces the laws, the legislative branch makes the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. And they each can check the power of the others. And that's where this idea of federalism comes in. Anti-federalists, and we'll get here to Jefferson. Here we go. Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton wants a strong central government. He wants it where a government has power to make decisions. So if anything that happens increases the power of the government, then that would be federalist. They also see the government as flexible, right? That the government can stretch and bend. And so therefore, when later in history, nowhere in the Constitution does it mention an Air Force. So you can simply pass a law and create it. Even if it says it doesn't say it in the Constitution, you can pass a law and therefore create that thing that's not there. The other way to kind of flex the Constitution is a thing called judicial review. The Supreme Court can go in and reinterpret the Constitution. Prime example would be the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment says any person born in the United States is a U.S. citizen, or naturalized if a person is naturalized. This has the rights of a citizen. Well, that person concept gets reinterpreted so that it applies to women. See how that works? You can simply stretch the Constitution by simply saying, no, this is what it means. All right? Jefferson thinks the Constitution should be set in stone. That the way you could change the Constitution or the interpretation of a Constitution is to add an amendment. Prime example would be what happened with the 13th Amendment. You had to add that into the Constitution to allow African Americans to vote. And later with the 19th Amendment to allow women to vote. And then later you had to change the Constitution again to allow 18-year-olds to vote. You couldn't just bend the Constitution. It was in the Constitution, so therefore you had to change the Constitution. They also want a smaller government. They don't trust a strong government because if they can just simply change the way you interpret it, or they can add things whenever they want, it infringes upon the rights of the people. However, sometimes you have to bend the Constitution because of things like wars, or like the Constitution says that you have the right to free commerce. On 9/11, the government shut down all air travel. Does the president have that power, or did he just flex the Constitution? See what I mean? So they both have pluses. They also have minuses. Also, these people tend to be Northerners. They tend to be also more commerce driven. These tend to be Southerners, and they tend to be more agricultural driven. So then we have the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was an excise tax put in to help fund the government. And it was basically on corn whiskey, because many of these people producing over the mountains in the new territories were producing corn and transporting in the form of whiskey, which then became a tax. Well, this is an example of federalism. Washington sends his military out to stop the rebellion. And he doesn't have approval from Congress. He calls up the militia to form a strong American government. And once again, proving the federal government is the top power. We then we're going to skip those things. We have to deal with the issue of slavery, right? And the problems and solutions. So we got to skip here. We talked about this part, elasticity. Okay, so the next problem is going to be Hamilton and the bank. Remember, Jefferson wants a small government. And he says if it's not in the Constitution, you can't put it there. Hamilton sees that we need a federal bank, right? Because you need to have one way to run currency in the United States. You need to have a centralized bank to take in the taxes and to spend the money, and to a degree control the economic growth of America. And he says we can do this because the Constitution is elastic. You simply make a law and it'll create a bank. Jefferson says, no, you can't do this. It's not in the Constitution. Well, if you've seen the musical Hamilton, that's what is being argued between Jefferson and Hamilton when they go into the room where it happens, where Madison and Jefferson go into the room and they debate this and won't let Burr in. Well, that's what they're doing. They're negotiating the bank. In the end, what happens is Hamilton gets his bank. Okay. Hamilton gets his bank, but Jefferson gets the capital in the southern states. He gets it in Maryland and along the Maryland-Virginia border. So this is an example of federalism, that you stretch the Constitution to put this bank in. Under Adams, we're going to see another example, but it's kind of a little bit of both. Is that Adams' administration, at the end of it, the very end of his administration, we're going to pass a thing called the Alien Sedition Act. Okay? And the Alien Sedition Act basically limited immigration in the United States and allowed the government the right to basically throw out immigrants that are coming in. Well, many of these immigrants were voting for the Republican Party, right? Or not the Republican Party, but for the anti-federalists, right? For the Democrats is what they call themselves. And so they also passed laws that said that you could not speak out against the government. And so the Federalists were trying to rig the system to stop the anti-Federalist Democratic Republicans from stopping them from speaking out against the government and getting more support. Well, and that's where Jefferson and Madison come in. So the Alien Sedition Act, would be an example of federalism, because they're increasing the power of the government to stop people from speaking out against them. And then Jefferson and Madison come back and do this Kentucky-Virginia resolution, which basically nullifies the law. They say that our states just aren't going to follow that law. We're not going to follow it. Doesn't matter you passed it. We're just not going to follow it. That would be an example of anti-federalism. Now, in the end, this became extremely embarrassing for the party that passed this, the Federalists, because it was seen as an overreach. And in the end, the Alien Sedition Act was gotten rid of. But it shows an example of, one, how the government increased its power with the Alien Sedition Act as a form of federalism, and that Jefferson and Madison's Virginia-Kentucky resolution is a good example of anti-federalism, where they try to rein in the power of the government. And then we're going to see a thing called Marbury versus Madison. Adams tries to appoint as many judges as he can at the very end. He's leaving office, and he says, I want to fill every seat I can. And one of these people was a man named Marbury. Well, Madison comes in. Madison becomes the new president, opposite political party. He won't seat Marbury. Marbury then sues Madison. He goes all the way to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, see, here's the thing. You're right. You should have got the seat, but we're not going to put you there because that's not our place. But they interpret the Constitution. So they say, this is what the law means. And that is the beginning. Marbury versus Madison, who I believe Madison wasn't the president. Madison was, I think he's not Secretary of State. Vice president? No. I'll think of it. But Marbury versus Madison basically sets up the concept of judicial review. And so that allows for the interpretation of the Constitution. Okay? That's what that means. Jefferson's continues, and this one is an example of the idea of federalism. Okay? That's what this one is. And this one, this is what we're dealing with now. Oh, Madison was Secretary of State. He wasn't the president. He was Secretary of State. Sorry, I was wandering off. Okay, so Louisiana Purchase, this is another example. So if that was federalism, remember, Jefferson's now the president, right? Comes in after Adams. That's how the musical goes, remember? So Jefferson comes in as president, and Jefferson is an anti-federalist, all right? So he wants to lower the power of the government. Well, there's one little catch here. Napoleon is fighting a war with the British, which is going to lead to a little thing called the War of 1812 here in the United States. But Jefferson needs to purchase this land from Napoleon. It will double the size of the United States. The problem is Napoleon needs the money fast, and they can't get the treaty signed and approved in time. So Jefferson goes ahead, signs the treaty, gives Napoleon the money before it's even ratified by Congress, which is not how it's supposed to work. You have to get the treaty ratified, then the president signs the treaty. So basically, he's expanded the power of the presidency. Here's a man who's anti-federalist, who wants a smaller, less powerful government, has just increased the power of the government and is a federalist action. See how that works? And then we have a little thing called the War of 1812. Now, this isn't in the notes and anything, but this is an example of how America we just put our country together, and we go right back to war with the British. We want Canada. We overreach. We end up backing the French because they backed us, and the British aren't having it. On top of it, the fact that the British are taking over American ships at sea triggers America declaring war on England. We get our butts kicked trying to move in to get against Canada, and then we get our capital burned. And then to save our butts, well, the best thing that happened was geography. The British are too occupied fighting Napoleon. They don't have time for you. And so the only real victory you have is you take the city of New Orleans, except there's a catch. You already own it. You captured your own city because the British had already signed a treaty with you, giving you New Orleans because they can't control it and they don't care to control it. And on top of it, they don't have the time to deal with you while fighting Napoleon. So yes, the War of 1812 in many cases is talked about as the Second War of American Independence, but you won more by geography than being scrappy. So And we're also going to talk about later a thing called the Monroe Doctrine, that during this time, kind of showing how the British work, because Monroe is the next president after Madison. And Monroe, basically, there's only one political party at this point, and all these little things. But Monroe, the British can't control the territories in this part of the world as well as they want to. They're busy licking things over in India and places like that and taking those over. So they basically say, all right, we're going to freeze everything in this hemisphere where we live. No one can move anything, can't take it over or anything. And we're going to let the Americans, with the backing of the British Navy, enforce this. So basically, the British gave you this hemisphere to control for them. So that's the beginning of American foreign policy. Plus, we got Florida, which was basically alligators at that point. So now here's where a couple more of these Federalists. We get Andrew Jackson, who's a rough and tough Westerner. And we'll talk more about him. And there's a lot of things about federalism and anti-federalism. One, he's going to kill the bank. Okay? He's going to kill the bank. He sees it as anti-federalist, is that he thinks the bank is hurting farmers out west. So when it comes time to recharter it, he doesn't. He won't recharter the bank. He lets it die, which is an example of anti-federalism. Okay, because he says it's not in the Constitution, it's hurting farmers, so he lets that bank that Hamilton created die. But then the same dude, right, wants the land in Georgia that Cherokees live on. Well, the Cherokees are one of the most advanced Native American tribes. They have a written language, they have laws, they have an entire economic and political system. And they live much like Western farmers. And they have educated members of their tribe, and they fight this all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, yes, these people have treaties that have to be represented and that you cannot move their land. Well, that doesn't stop Jackson. Jackson packs them up, ships them off, and sends them on a march called the Trail of Tears all the way across the Mississippi to Oklahoma, which was horrible land at the time. And the Cherokee, along the way, that's how many of you may have Cherokee blood, is how that people married into families of Western settlers as they moved. And this was a horrible thing that these people were pushed out of their land and pushed into the western part of the United States. And how does this fit into federalism or not federalism? Well, it's simple. It fits into federalism because he doesn't have the power to do this. The Supreme Court said you can't move them. And then they basically put an injunction on him. That's what that means, is where you can't legally do this. And then Jackson responds, well, the Supreme Court doesn't have an army, so let's see them stop me. And by the time they do take more legal actions, it's already too late. Native populations are moved, the land's been confiscated and redistributed to white farmers. So that increased the power of the government. And it sets up many of the things we're going to talk about after the Civil War. The last one is another nullification thing. And this should complete your chart. So if you haven't noticed, these were all the things that are answering to the chart thing that was an assignment. All right. What happened was a tax was put in by Northern supported politicians. It was a huge tariff. Now, Jackson doesn't overly like this tariff, but it doesn't matter. It's a law. And Southern states, namely led by the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun, does not like this tariff. They feel that it hurts farmers because the major export by America was cotton and farm products. But the tariff helps industrialists in the North, which is a growing industrial revolution happening in America. So they decide again that they are going to nullify the law. They're not going to follow it. They openly tell the government, we will not follow, will not collect, will not support this tariff, and even threaten to leave the Union, which at this point, Andrew Jackson, being the tough fighting kind of guy he is, says, fine, then I'm going to march down there and I'm going to hang every single one of you. And he threatens to use military force to rein in these southern states. Again, this would be an example. You could say it's anti-federalist because southern states were standing up against a strong central government. You can definitely see how this is an example of federalism because they're basically threatened to leave the Union, and the president of the United States, without declaring war or having any ability to do that, threatens to shoot them all. Matter of fact, when he was interviewed later after he left office, a reporter asked Jackson what was the one thing he regretted to do, and he basically said, "I didn't get a chance to hang my vice president." So that would be an example of federalism, or the nullification itself is an example of anti-federalism. So like I said, folks, these are examples of how and why this is important. Is the argument the argument that's going to lead to the slavery or to the Civil War is slavery. Slavery inherently put into a system where people were seen as free, right? That what America is going to become is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You create a country that inherently did not live up to that promise. And then as economic, social, political pressure came onto slavery, namely caused by westward movement, this idea of federalism creeped in also to make this situation even worse. The slavery itself is what causes the Civil War, but the ability of the government to take away those slaves becomes the argument from southern states saying, look, this is my right, this is my property. By the Constitution, I have the right to. That's the anti-federalist argument, that these slaves are my property. But then inherently, the other side, the Federalists, are going to argue, but the Constitution gives us the ability to stretch the Constitution, to put in laws or to interpret the Constitution in a way that solves this problem of slavery. And they simply say, what you're calling a slave is a person, and we have every right to stretch the Constitution to free these people. So it's not states' rights, it's the argument. It's federalism. Does the government have the ability to basically override the state constitutions and that? So I guess you try to say it's states' rights, but it's not. It's an argument about the Constitution. And in the end, it really comes down to one simple thing. You cannot in any way belittle it, that none of this, notice, we've had 3 examples where they would not follow the law, and that we've had all these examples where the government is expanding the power of the government. But it still goes back to the issue of slavery. That's what inherently is going to cause the Civil War, because they had plenty of time to overthrow the government before, and they don't. It's when push comes to shove over this issue is when they finally go to, shooting at Fort Sumter. So hopefully this fills in your chart. Okay, but this is how the federalism, anti-federalism, and I guess you'd call it states' rights issue fits in to the bigger problem, which is slavery. Okay, it's not the states' rights isn't the issue. It's the slavery is the issue. Okay, so this helps you with the chart and get you up to speed on what we've talked about in class. So hope this helps. If you have any question, make sure to ask me in class or email me. All right.